Hi everyone, welcome to the very first episode of Brown People Problems, a podcast where I, Nikita Sehgal, chat with my guests about what it means to navigate life while being brown. So for our very first episode today, I wanted to chat about why we need to have these conversations. Why do South Asian stories, why do brown stories, why do our experiences matter, and why should we talk about them? And joining me for my very first conversation today is Angie Agarwal Holstein. Angie has been a social worker for 20 years in Toronto, and she specializes in offering support to the South Asian community, complex trauma, youth concerns, as well as being an EMDR certified therapist. Angie now has a second practice in Toronto called Shanti Psychotherapy that specializes in providing care to South Asian individuals, as well as being inclusive to all other communities of people of color. Currently, Angie lives in Toronto with her partner of 25 years and her 3 children. So let's get into our conversation.
Well, welcome to this episode of Brown People Problems. Thank you so much for being here, Angie.
Nikita, thanks for having me. It was really exciting to be invited to do this today.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've kind of just been talking about the podcast here and there, and there's so many things that you and I kind of, resonate with, and we have some similar values when it comes to talking about what it means to be brown and navigating that. So I just knew that you would be perfect.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I really loved our conversations. I think we don't have enough of them, and I really welcome that, our friendship, our being colleagues and being able to talk about things that are new.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Absolutely.
Great platform.
Yeah, thank you. So I know you recently rebranded your practice to Shanti Psychotherapy. Tell me more about that. Like, what prompted you to start Shanti?
I'm glad you asked. So, what it really is it's a second practice. So I've been practicing as a psychotherapist. I've been a social worker and for, almost 20 years. I can't believe it's hitting 20 years at this point. And I've been in private practice for 7 years now. And, my practice focuses on trauma, complex trauma. I was working a lot with youth. And for the first time after, not working in a hospital or an agency setting or a school, I had a web presence. And very naturally, what started to happen was clients of South Asian background were seeking out therapy with me and really being able to identify, seeking affinity, wanting a therapist who could perhaps understand the nuances of being a first-generation Canadian, growing up as a person of color, the cultural nuances, some of the family nuances, issues with boundaries or adulting, all those kind of things that may be part of the, South Asian, either first gen experience or wherever they grew up. And, I have to say by now, 70% of my own private practice is, based on South Asian clients. And I really was, welcome and honored to support that kind of work. And so what happened with Shanti was, I wasn't able as a single practitioner to necessarily, be there for all the clients that were looking for affinity in their therapist. So, I'd met people like you and other clinicians of South Asian background saying, there's a need here. We know that there's a lot of silent mental health issues for our community. And that's partly how Shanti was born. So Shanti is a second practice for me. And it's a group practice of really like-minded clinicians who focus on being non-judgmental, compassionate, focus on attachment and trauma work, and really understanding kind of the first-gen, issues based on their own education and also being South Asian in background themselves. So Shanti Psychotherapy is really about South Asians serving South Asians. Yeah. And we do include all other communities, of course. We have mental health expertise for all other communities. We just want to also put out there loud and proud that this is what we do and what our expertise is, and that it's okay for you to need that as a South Asian person seeking support through therapy.
Yeah, I love that. South Asians supporting South Asians. Yeah. I think that's lovely. And that's so important, right? I'm just thinking of, for our listeners who don't know, I'm also a psychotherapist. in Toronto, and I find that most people who reach out nowadays, they're looking for a cultural fit first and foremost, right? Someone is no longer coming to me and saying, hey, I want a CBT therapist, but everyone is coming to me now and saying, you know what, I really appreciate your take on the immigrant experience. I appreciate that we're from the same cultural background. Yeah. And I need someone who understands what it means to be in this culture. Yeah. Right? Which is exactly what prompted this podcast, right? Brown People Problems, right? That it's a unique set of experiences, right? That comes with being Indo-Canadian, and just what that looks like for us as we navigate that.
And I think that's a really important piece of reflection, to be able to notice that clients and people coming are actually naming that need, and that need can be okay. Mm-hmm. Right, that this part of the identity, right, and when we look at intersectionality of Indo-Canadians, there's an intersectionality of culture. Is it okay to show up from, you know, the cultural background of being South Asian, of Indian, whichever country of, you know, that umbrella fits for you, and to say, this is a normal need for me to have support for this part of my identity too. And I need a safe place. I need some affinity. We'll talk, you know, we can talk about what that means as well. That's, you know, for you and I, we might know what that means, but just being able to have somebody that looks like me, that could empathize and reduces that piece around shame and judgment. And it's okay to need that.
Absolutely. I think that is so important, right, in therapy. But I would love to get your sort of take, Angie, on why you think conversations like this podcast are, you know, important. Why do you think these are necessary? Why should we be getting on these platforms and just talking about what it means to be brown?
I think that's a great question. And I think that's a question that probably comes from many different cultures, right? Many different parts of our society, in the confusion of difference. It makes us uncomfortable to talk about difference. Right. So I think, you know, first and foremost, I think about conversations really help to reduce divisiveness, right? To be able to reduce the mystery of another, right? Yeah. It's another person's experience, another person's story. And isn't it better to be able to share those, disseminate those stories to listeners of all race and backgrounds, all people of ages, it doesn't matter. Right? So that otherwise we're all kind of staying in our echo chambers. And when I think about that, even my face kind of goes like, it feels like stuckness. Right? So I want to hear stories from, you know, our Indigenous members, our Canadian, you know, society. I want to hear those stories. I want to hear the stories of, say, first generation Irish immigration. Like, I want to hear all of that. Right? And I also want to share my own story. And can that be okay? And can that be important?
Yeah, I love that. You know, one of the things that I have recently kind of noticed in the last few years happening, not just in the industry of, you know, therapy and the community of social work, but just generally, people are feeling a little bit more and more comfortable with sharing their stories, their experiences, their cultural experiences. And that's exactly what my hope is, right, with this podcast, is to just add to that conversation on what it means to navigate a whole bunch of milestones, life experiences while being brown. And what are some unique sort of problems, unique experiences, unique challenges that we face, and how can we work through those?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful part of, you know, what you're reflecting on, is that we're seeing more and more of this in, you know, many cultures, right? These pieces around identity are okay to talk about. And change makes us uncomfortable. Right? Anytime there's change, there's going to be discomfort. And it can be perceived as dangerous, or, you know, there can be shame. That it reduces the isolation if we're sharing, and sometimes there's not always a solution, But being able to, like I love the title of the podcast, Brown People Problems, right? We might not be able to fix all of those problems.
Right.
But being able to let's be with the mass in compassion together, right? So that people don't feel, because often when you're struggling, you feel like you're the only one. It's only like this for you because there's something defective about you.
Yeah.
So the collective voices can really help to start healing some of that feeling of isolation, which impacts our wellness.
Absolutely. So, you've been chatting a lot, Angie, about attunement, affinity. Can you tell our listeners what those terms mean?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's really good to start, using and understanding more of this language. And I've only been, I got to be honest, using this language and learn these terms in the last 10 years. So, attunement is a really important concept. I want everyone to know about it. And many of your listeners may already know, just based on, so much more of the research that's coming out around interpersonal neurobiology and this biological need for attunement. So attunement, if we think about it like tuning in, attunement is our reactiveness towards another person, and it's how our relationships are formed. So I want to read you a quote by Dan Sehgal, who's my favorite author, researcher, and psychiatrist, also a professor down in the southern United States. He talks about attunement being this resonance. So attunement is resonance being the heart of the important sense of feeling felt. So I just want to hold that language, feeling felt. And that's what emerges in close relationships. And we all need that. And it's okay to need that. So if we think about children, right, children need their parents to attune to them. They need to feel secure and safe and connected so that they can develop, so their brains can develop and grow, right? Emotionally, to be able to manage their emotions, to be able to play, to be able to learn, right? All those things we need in those critical years as our brain is growing. And we also need that attunement throughout our lives. We need to be able to feel close and connected to other people. And I think we don't really sometimes understand enough or talk enough about this biological need for connection. Connectedness is actually one of the 5 pillars of health. So we've got nutrition, sleep, exercise, social connectedness, and pathways to reading. This was the last one that was recently added. So if we think about pillars of health being, what is the house of wellness standing on? These are the basics. And that's where attunement fits in. We all need to feel felt by another person.
I love that. That really makes me think about how we now live in we live in a culture that places such emphasis on hyper independence, right? That it's prized and socially rewarded to be emotionally independent and all sorts of independence. I understand that it comes from a place of self-sufficiency and empowerment, but I think we've taken it a little bit too far as a society, right? And if you now want connection, or if you want to be felt by another person, or if you want that type of connectedness, it's almost shamed.
Needing is feeling, having a need, right? It's almost like the word I need is like a dirty word in what the context that you're talking about, right? We're a privileged, developed society. And so with that privilege comes growth mindset. Gotta hustle, gotta be thinner, gotta be better, gotta be smarter, right? There's always something we're striving towards instead of being with. Like, how much are we being with each other? And I've really observed that whole piece around the hyper independence, and it feels like a badge of honor at times to be super, super stressed out, working, and doing it all alone. I got all of this under control, and it's like, bang, it's like a badge of honor. And there's not enough space to talk about the impact on wellness, and that it actually is neglecting a very important need to connect. Just even to name out loud, it's been a really hard day. I'm feeling anxious, right? So when we think about emotions, just being able to be with those feelings with another, and for another person to attune back. Yeah, it sounds like a really hard day. Right here.
Yeah, and then I think about how much of a foreign concept, right, that is, because as a culture, as it is, there's large focus on being hyper independent. And then I think about what it means to grow up in a brown household when there's so much emphasis placed on performance and success and ambition. And while all those can be really lovely things, I think that really feeds then that need for self-sufficiency and that need for hyper independence.
Absolutely. And, as if we look at kind of, South Asian culture, let's just, take brownness for a moment, just as you said, in our families, where does the intergenerational trauma come? Right? When we think about even that piece around hyper performance, get super good at something, survive, be independent. I look back at my own dad. He was really loving. He was a loving dad, and he was focused on academics. I can look back now after my own healing and my own work and joining with others and, hearing this commonality in my community. He used to say, I'd bring home like a 98% in calculus. He'd go, what happened? You lost the 2%. And as a kid, it felt, that doesn't feel good, right? Like I tried so hard. And now as an adult, I can look back and look at the trauma, like it's a bloody history coming down in South Asian culture, right? A partition, colonialism. We had parents that were in survival mode, right? And can we start to notice that hyper independence, being stressed, working really, really hard, getting the best grades, is this the symptom of trauma? Right? You must survive so that you can be safe. I love you so much. I need you to survive so you can be safe. Right? And just starting to understand and have conversations about the nuances of those experiences. We can't fix it, but we can be with each other and attune to that. Right? Yeah. So that legacy burden doesn't have to continue.
Yeah. I love that. Because I think you really hit the nail on the head, right? When you were talking about that badge of honor. I think a lot of us have learned to use suffering as a benchmark with which we measure success.
Absolutely.
And to recognize that as a trauma response in a way, right? That like community trauma and that trauma response, that can really help someone just become a little bit more in touch and attuned with their own process. That's exactly why, conversations like the one that we're having today is so important, because what we're, for our listeners, what we're really trying to do is to create that attunement through conversation.
Absolutely. And so listening and feeling felt can come from so many different platforms, right? So attunement can come from listening to another's experience that is similar to our own or has nuances of similarity, feels familiar, can bring those feelings of belonging. Attunement can come in writing about your story, write your narrative, write your family narrative, write about, what happened in your day and attune to the feelings that were going along with that day. Mindfulness practice, sharing with another directly, right? There's so many pathways to attunement. And we know from, Dan Siegel's research and other kinds of research in interpersonal neurobiology that it actually builds our brains. Attunement builds capacity in our brain. When I started to read that research, just blew my hair back, right? Just amazing that something so simple of just being with somebody, listening, attuning, could have such a biological and impact on wellness.
Yeah, tell me more about that, because I'm thinking of people in my life who have said to me, well, talking to someone doesn't really help me. And speaking my story or speaking my experience doesn't really help me. But tell me more about what is the research that exists that actually quantifies this and tells us that it does help.
So I'm going to introduce my cat too. You might see her coming, she loves when I'm having conversations to come and to be part of the conversation. So I think that's a great question, because I think we hear this from people. And I like to say to people where they say talking doesn't help me, I don't want to go back and remember my story or feel my story. And, that's where in conversations, attunement is about being able to just be with them and where they're at. And that's okay. And that there's really good reasons for them to not be going back in history or to feel that they need to keep their emotions at a distance. And, maybe someday or in different ways, they can start to metabolize some of the pain that keeps those barriers of connection in place. Maybe they have other ways that they feel attuned or connected with people, right? Sports or, other ways of belonging. There's so many different ways. I hope for people, I think I'm, maybe perhaps you and I are a bit biased based on the research and our own experiences in our profession, knowing, the benefits of being able to talk and share. And that doesn't always mean that it's with a therapist. Right? The research really talks about how talking out loud, right? So your brain can code out loud, and hear it back. Just the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors, the situations. And, it can really help people to be able to move forward with their goals. It helps to deal with self-criticism. When we're in our heads, we often experience much more self-criticism than when we are engaged in a dialogue or conversation. Right? So really, just simply even, talking out loud, the research says, can change and help us access our goals, shift negative thinking, calm the amygdala, our emotion center, and help us reduce the amount of self-criticism that we're experiencing. Simply by talking. So encouraging people to take little, titrated steps towards talking even about a part, or listening to a part, especially when it comes to identity. Can we just start to talk about this, and feel our way through this together?
Absolutely. It helps to offer perspective, right? And there's that active reflection that comes with talking out loud, because we can have all sorts of messy thoughts and beliefs in our head, but when we start to coherently string them along, it creates a very active process of reflection, which is actually why I share with my clients some journaling prompts, because it can seem really mundane, just talking out loud or journaling, but that's really helpful. It helps you to reflect. And when we can reflect, we almost become an active participant in how we are making sense of our story.
Absolutely. And there's agency. You and I have talked about agency before, right? When it comes to, when there's lots of trauma or, intergenerational trauma, well, then we're dealing with issues of power, right? And brownness. And, based on where we sit in the, social, are in relation to the dominant, we're going to be dealing with issues of power. And that's okay to talk about that, right? Because, powerlessness creates stress. And there are aspects, it's okay to talk about that there are aspects of brownness that can create that powerlessness at work and, educational institutes. We're still working through racism in institutions, right? And as Canadians, we tend to not want to, name it versus, let's name it. Let's just name the problem. Let's work on that together, people of all colors. And, when we think about stress just neurologically, just like you said, kind of being in your head versus talking out loud, writing down, moving those thoughts and those feelings out, right, to the external. We know from research that it actually reduces the firing of the amygdala, that emotion center in the brain, right? It creates some more cohesion and co-regulation of all the, all the activity in this one part of our brain, the limbic system, where we hold our memories and where we hold our emotion center and our information processing center, right? So can we process in a different way? Yes, process in your head. Also look at all these other ways. And the benefits of reducing stress means that we're healthier. Our immune systems are healthier. We got robust research to show that, right? So conversations sounds like just such a regular word, yet there's so much packed into that, right?
Exactly. I like how you said that it doesn't even have to be a conversation with a therapist. Even just listening to our conversation today can help introduce, right, that reflection piece for someone, can help someone like reflect and be curious about their own experiences and how those have shaped them.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of that's what therapy is about helping create those insights, right? So moving what's inside and the thought process inside and the emotions in the body, some, you know, the body reactions that go along with that, you know, attuning to that, you know, for someone to care about that someone's inner experience to be cared for, you know, is so vitally important for all people. And if, you know, even if this conversation is happening with a friend, conversation in a journal, conversation with a therapist or a family member, you know, it provides us this really important skill to practice of recognizing what is happening. So the opposite of autopilot into awareness, just naming what is happening, naming the emotions, reflecting. And then the brain can be rewired through different strategies and skills, right? But once we're attuned, we have to attune and reflect, recognize, then rewire. So conversations are critically important.
Conversations matter.
They do.
Yeah. Simply put, in conversations around what it means to be brown, right, also really matter.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just amazing, right? Something so seemingly mundane can have such a powerful impact on us.
And you know, Nikita, when we were talking about this podcast and even just having a conversation about this conversation, you know, it made me reflect in the time in between if anyone had ever asked me, what was it like to grow up brown? Like, I don't think even, you know, there's such a newness to this type of conversation, this kind of dialogue. And it really struck me like, I don't even, I know, of course I've done my own work around reflecting and being with this part of my identity now compared to when I was a kid. And now here we are just sitting in a, you know, sitting together. This question is very specific and named and asked and received. Big change.
Absolutely. I remember in my graduate training, there was a huge emphasis on reflection and critical thinking and exploring like your own cultural piece. And that was such a fascinating time for me because this is not the kind of stuff that we grow up actively reflecting on, right? Unless we're part of some very specific circles and conversations. And that was the first time that I really kind of just got thinking, okay, who am I? How have my experiences really shaped me? And not just some obviously clinical things like immigration stress or trauma, but some of the other more nuanced experiences like growing up in an immigrant household, growing up with brown values, right? What does that look like? And I think that's exactly the type of things that we need to explore a little bit more because everyone's experience in that is also a little bit different, right? There's so much variation. How I've experienced being brown is different from what you have experienced. It's different from what our listeners have experienced. We share a lot of qualities and we share a lot of themes in those experiences, but our individual experiences are so varied. And if we want to get to know ourselves a little bit better, or we want to move forward more sort of like mindfully and intentionally and how we shape our lives, we have to, my bias thinking is we have to kind of reflect on this. We have to think about this.
Absolutely. That was so beautifully said. So beautifully said. I would say ditto to all of that. Absolutely. And it's, you know, when you say we have to start to reflect on this, can it be safer to reflect on this? What is it going to take for it to feel safer? Right? Because, you know, a lot of my clients, a lot of, you know, friends, I talk to my own sister and, you know, family members around, you hear this common theme of having a feeling like there needs to be a dilution of the identity in order to survive here. right?
Yeah.
Or to fit in, not only survive, but to thrive. When you think about when you're a kid, you just need friends and you just want to fit in and belong.
Mm.
And we know from, Brene Brown's, incredible research on belonging, that this is also a biological need to belong under that, umbrella of connection.
Yeah.
And, difference can feel isolating and shaming versus if there is, ways that you can share your identity in a safe and comfortable way, even with some discomfort, right? Because whenever we're starting to make those changes, it creates a ripple effect in all the systems. So those receiving and also those delivering, right? The discomfort is shared. So, I think about safety a lot in these kind of environments. And I think that's where affinity comes in, that, we also need to be able to practice in safe places where, we feel felt by a similar racial group, that need is okay before we take that kind of practice out into the larger dominant society. Because, in fairness to, people say outside of our racialized group, maybe we haven't shared enough of our stories. I know that there's reasons for that, right? And so, being able to share those stories, to be able to receive them in a safe enough way, I think that's the power of conversations. That it doesn't mean that sharing about, nuances of being an immigrant family, or, seeing racism for our parents and the grief that caused, and that doesn't mean that the other has done something wrong. It's just being with in compassion and hearing and listening and attuning. So much power and healing in that.
Yeah, just being with. I love that. Oh, we could keep going on about this hours and hours and possibly days, but it's been
Absolutely
so lovely talking to you about this today, Angie. It's already, got me thinking just so much more about my own identity. I find that work is endless, quite frankly.
Yeah. And it possibly maybe doesn't have an end, right? Like to accept that our identities are always kind of, there's aspects that are changing as we age, 30s, 40s, 50s. Each year brings and shapes different things. So, again, that reflection and the conversations are so important. And I can't thank you enough for allowing me to be part of this, inviting me to be part of this. I'm just, really support what you're doing in, it's not just the simplicity of it, but it's so accessible to say, let's join in conversation when we think about safety. What a beautiful platform you're providing, and such a, non-judgmental and compassionate way that you can move through conversations. It's been really a pleasure.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. It's been lovely having you on to talk about. I will be linking all of Angie's information in the description bar below, and possibly also some Dan Sehgal's work if some listeners and viewers are interested in that. It's just so fascinating. So if anyone wants to look more at that, they can find more information below. But thank you so much for being part of this today, Angie. This was really lovely talking to you about this.
Absolutely. My pleasure completely, Nikita. I really enjoyed our conversations. I always do. And this was also just a wonderful platform. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Disclaimer: the guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully. Thank you.